Let's talk about correlation. Let's talk about usage, shooting efficiency. Does it actually have an impact? Michael Bolton.
Thanks, Josh. It's Michael Bolton here, and it's time for another episode of the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Let's get to it.
Let's get to it, indeed.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NBA fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast, brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd, and Godspeed, Little Doodle. I'm also the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com, and today's episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. Thank you also for making Locked On Fantasy Basketball your first listen every day. We are free and we are available on all platforms. All right, this is a show that has been pre-recorded, as I'm sure you're aware, that I am currently away. Currently over in the United States. I'm currently been watching Summer League games, or I don't know, at the time you're watching this, I'm probably not. I'm probably just having a few days off. But that's okay, because this is an evergreen topic. And this is something that I discussed during the year when we were talking about, and we talk about this sort of off the cuff a lot. Everyone does in the NBA, in fantasy circles. We talk about this idea of how players respond to taking more shots and how that impacts their value in fantasy, how it impacts their overall efficiency, etc. So we're going to try and have a look, and I think that we could use field goal percentage as the correlation number here. But what I did is I wanted to look at when players get more usage, what happens to their effective field goal percentage. Right, just a very simple correlation of numbers to see like when a player needs to do more, and that's what usage is. Usage is the measurement of when a player is on the court. How many possessions do they end? And there's three ways you end a possession, of course. You take a shot, you take a free throw, and you turn it over, which is just a general idea of how involved you are on the court, right? Effective field goal percentage is a shooting percentage that doesn't include free throws. It includes 2-pointers and 3-pointers, so the regular shots that aren't free throws, but there's a weighting for 3-point percentage or 3-point shots, because obviously they're worth more. So, we want to look at just overall efficiency. I think it's a good example of shooting efficiency. True shooting percentage is a good representation of scoring efficiency. Slightly different things. But I'm sure all of you are aware of this. Now, this might be somewhat of a dry topic because we're looking at stats and correlations and Pearson coefficients and all that sort of stuff. But all of this stuff, we'll get the takeaways out of it. All of this stuff has an impact in how we view players and how we view fantasy value and how we look at things with trades and players changing teams and evolutions of players and all that sort of stuff. I do think there is importance in this. We've done the correlations on this show for years about how individual stats interact with each other in single seasons. We've looked at how individual stats go year by year and where the variance is and what we can and can't rely upon, all that sort of stuff. And we will do that again. I'm very certain those patterns will remain the same. This is a new topic, though. It's a topic that's been talked around in fantasy circles, in real life circles, but maybe the data is out there. I don't know. I haven't seen it actually put out this way, but I wanted to do it myself, and I wanted to get in there and actually just take a look at the ways that we can sort of, I guess, I don't know what the right word is, judge, I guess, the impact of usage and efficiency on players. So what are we actually going to look at here? Like I said, we're testing usage percentage, we're testing effective field goal percentage. So the hypothesis is the higher your usage, the more you need to do, the lower your efficiency. So the more shots you take, it means you have to take harder shots. It means you're relied upon more in the offense. It means you take more contested shots. It means you take more late shot clock shot attempts. Therefore, the harder attempts you take, the more you take, the less likely you are to be as efficient. If you're only taking a few shots per game and they're all at the rim, it's easier to do that. If you're having to take on and beat double teams or be the contested shot maker, it is a little bit harder, and the guys that thrive at that obviously become stars. What I did in this, now this again, always with any sort of data or any sort of stats or whatever you want to look at, it's important to know how this stuff is being presented. So what I did is I had a look at the stats over the last 4 seasons. I could have gone back further and further, but I think 4 seasons is a good sort of range at this point to look at. There were 298 players who have played in the last 4 seasons. There are certain players, say for example, Kawhi Leonard, Jamal Murray, Zion Williamson, Victor Wembanyama. These guys haven't played in all 4 years, either due to not being in the league or being injured for one of those years. So I just took those guys out. I wanted to get people with 4 years of data into this. And there was 298 players who had data for 4 consecutive years. And we're testing usage against effective field goal percentage. My expectation is, as I'm sure yours is, that the more that a player does, the more usage they have, the less efficient they become. And the thing that I think we believe here is that the true superstars are the ones that are able to buck that trend. They're the ones who are able to maintain efficiency with higher usage. That's what separates those players from others. That's what I expect what I expected heading in to look at this data. All right, and I set your own expectations. How do you think that this stuff looks? How do you think that this can play out? What do you think the result is? Set our expectations before we dive in and take a look at it. Now we will just dive in and take a look at it. Like I said, I said 290. It's actually 297 players. My bad. That played in all of those games from 21 to 22. All right, 297 players. If you aren't aware of what R and R squared means, I'll explain that. I'll explain that now. R is called the Pearson coefficient. It is a number that ranges from 1 to -1. It's basically the gradient on a graph of X-Y axis. If you have a R of 1, it means that as one number rises, the other number rises perfectly. It rises the same rate. It's like the perfect 45-degree angle other way on the screen, on the slope, right? If you've got a -1, it's the opposite. It means that the higher one number goes, other way, down, the higher one number goes, the lower the other one is. So if we had an R of -1, that would mean the higher the usage, the lower the effective field goal percentage. If we had an R of +1, it would mean the higher the usage, the higher the effective field goal percentage in perfect harmony. R squared is a number that doesn't tell you direction. It's the same thing. It's just R, obviously just squared. So when you square something, it's a negative, it becomes a positive. So there's no like this is showing you which direction it goes. What R squared shows is what proportion of this variance is attributed to the stats we're looking at versus other factors. So when we look at this, and I put all of these 297 players that had played games in the force last year, starting from the 21-22 season through to 24-25. The Pearson coefficient, the R, was -0.23, meaning that we did get a negative result. Which, of course, the takeaway, what that means is that the higher your usage, the lower your effective field goal percentage. And, you could throw vice versa. The higher the effective field goal percentage, the lower the usage. But we're looking at the other way around. We're looking at usage impacting effective field goal percentage. So the more you need to do, the higher your usage is, the more it goes down. Now, if you have a 0 in R, it means there's no correlation. It's entirely random. So we're at a -0.23. It's not -1, which is a perfect correlation. It's not 0, which is no correlation. So it's a weak negative correlation. Meaning there is an impact, and it's noticeable, but it's not like, this is just obvious. And when you look at the R squared, which gets to 0.05, that means that 5% of the variance in effective field goal percentage is due to usage. That's not that much. So I think that number probably strikes you a little bit differently. You go, I would just think more usage means less efficient. And it does, but sort of. It's clearly not a blanket rule. It's a rule, don't get me wrong. And we're going to break it down a little bit more to look at certain areas and groupings of players to understand where we can take this. But if you just want the overall takeaway, it's a -0.23 R, which is a weak negative correlation, meaning that, there is something about this, that the more usage you have, the worse of an efficiency player you become. That's your general takeaway, but it's by no means suggesting that it is a blanket rule and it's incredibly strong. It's noticeable, it's important, but it's not like this absolute just death knell for efficiency. So we'll come back and we'll break these down a little bit more. Today's episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Do you ever wish that managing your money felt easier? With Monarch Money, it can. You might be growing your savings, planning a big purchase, whatever it is. Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money is more than a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all of your accounts, your investments, and your spending in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building wealth. It might be you're looking at your spending and, wow, there's a lot of things here on takeout or subscriptions or, I don't know, you're getting your nails done. I don't know. But you can check it. You can see, does that make sense? Should I be cutting back here? Where can I put this money? How do I invest it? You can track this stuff. You can share it with your partner. You can build that wealth with Monarch Money. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That is monarchmoney.com. The code is LOCKEDONNBA for half off your first year. Okay, so we are talking about correlation here. We're talking about the impact of usage and effective field goal percentage, so shooting efficiency overall. Now, of course, effective field goal percentage isn't a category in fantasy. We are all well aware of that. But it is a good placeholder number for the impact of field goal percentage, but just the general efficiency of a player. Okay? So I think that's a good way of looking at it. And we looked at it, negative 0.23 across all 297 players. But I think that it's better to break this stuff down. Now, I said I had 297 players that qualified here. I went in and looked at the players, all these players, and the top, and I split them into groups. So out of those 297 players, the top 25 of those guys. Now, that is not, this is really important. So if you're watching on this graphic here, you can see of qualified players. This is not the top 25 fantasy ranked players from last season using Durant metrics. It's sort of that. But because let's use Victor Wembanyama, for example. He did not play all 4 years, so he's not in that. So it's the top 25 guys of the qualified 297, which accounts for, I think it was the top 28 guys, right? The ranked 26 to 50 is not the top 50 fantasy players. It's 26 to 50 of the qualified group, which is about 80 guys or 75 guys or whatever it is. But it's just a rough idea. So I'm not saying that these are the top 50 fantasy guys or the top 100 guys. It's the top 100 out of this group, or it's the top 50 out of this group. And as a general rule, it's not that far off. Like, I think the top 100, if we look at the top 100 out of this group of 297, it's like 150 players, or the ranking stretches from 1 to 160 in fantasy or something along those lines. Right, so it's not a big difference. Obviously, when you get towards the end, the 200 to 297, that stretches down to like players that have been ranked 500th even as well. There are players like Sam Merrill, who played in one of those years, or Kevin Knox has played some of those years. So we're talking about the bottom barrel stuff. If you are watching on YouTube, you can already see how the correlations look for these different groupings. So I've done 1 to 25, 26 to 50, 51 to 100, 100 to 200, and then 200 through to the end. You will notice that most of the groups have pretty decent negative correlations. 26 to 50 is a negative 0.31. 51 to 100 is negative 0.48. That's a pretty strong thing. Negative 0.37 is the guys ranked between 101 and 200. And then the guys from 200 onwards is negative 0.28. So they're all pretty strong numbers. What you will notice is that the top 25 players of the qualified players who played in the last 4 years, the top 25 guys, the correlation was negative 0.06, meaning there was no correlation. It was the weakest of weak negatives. So for your top end guys, which goes back to our hypothesis at the start, the takeaway is that those top end guys didn't really matter if their usage went up or usage went down. Efficiency didn't really change, or not didn't change, but it wasn't dependent on that. It might have gone up, it might have gone down, but it wasn't related as strongly there. But if you are a guy that was in the 51 to 100 range, based on last season's fantasy rankings, well, you were in a situation where as your usage increased over your career, your efficiency went down pretty like at a good number. 0.48 is a pretty useful correlation number. So you will notice this, that because the guys between 51 and 100, these are sort of your back end fantasy guys. You're in that 50, so 70 to 150 range of fantasy rankings players. That sort of a player, we saw big drops in efficiency as they needed to do more. The higher you get up to the better players, it doesn't impact them as much. Now, those of you that are statistically inclined might look at this and go, okay, Josh, that's great, whatever. Your top 25 players here, we know they're good because they were ranked in the top 25 this last season. So what does it mean? What is that telling us? How is that important? Like, does that tell us anything for the future? Because that's looking back, right? That's saying these were the top 25 guys last season, and you can see that usage and effective field goal percentage weren't really correlated. What does it mean as we look forward to that? Is there any data on that? Oh, I'm glad that you asked, even if you didn't, because I did look back at this. And what I went through is I sorted the players that I had based on their fantasy rankings from each of the 4 years, 21, 22, 22, 23, 24, 25, or 23, 24, and 24, 25. And I wanted to see what would happen. Because obviously the top 25 players from 21, 22 is not the same in 22, 23, or 23, 24, or 24, 25. It's not the same. Okay? It changes. So I wanted to see how that sort of played out. What did it mean? If we look back at these sort of players, how does it hold? What does it do? Well, I've got that data. So if I look at the top 25 players using the fantasy ranks from 21-22 season, the correlation on those guys of usage to effective field goal percentage is somehow a positive. Plus 0.19. That's it. That's interesting, isn't it? Meaning that grouping of players, as their usage went up over the 4 years, their effective field goal percentage went up. Okay. So, all right. If we use the 22-23 rankings, the correlation was negative 0.01. If we use the 23-24 rankings, it was negative 0.10. If we use the 24-25, I've already shown that, it's negative 0.06. So it doesn't really matter what year we use. These players that were considered in the top 25, your top 3 rounds, let's say, of fantasy players, no matter what it is, what year, they seem to be relatively immune from big changes in effective field goal percentage that is driven by usage. Their shooting doesn't change that much based on those things. And you know that to be a player who's a top 25 fantasy player, you can't just be a shooter or a scorer. You've got to do a lot of stuff. You've got to contribute in defensive stats somewhere, steals or blocks, or both. You've got to be a good free throw guy usually, although not. This is using Durant rankings, so there's head-to-head punting taken into consideration. You've got to be able to get rebounds. You've got to be able to be an assist guy. You can hit threes. You've got to be able to do more than just score to be a top 25 player. So these players, and we talk about scope for players to get into ranges like this. We talk about it all the time in fantasy. How does he become this guy? Because you've got to be able to hit multiple categories. And those are the players that become stars and superstars. And when they're able to do that, then the vagaries or the impact of doing more on efficiency disappears. It's sort of just wiped out. And you can see it's like a little bit all over the place. A positive 1.9, then negative 0.1, negative 1.0, negative 0.6. It's all just hovering around 0, and obviously it all just comes out around that 0 mark. Of like, there's no real correlation in it. Which I think is, again, it's an interesting discovery. There were 14 players that found themselves in the top 25 in each of the 4 seasons that I tracked. 4 of those players had a positive R value. 10 of them, obviously, had a negative R value. And if I just look at those 14 players only, the guys who were top 25 in 21-22, 22-23, 23-24, and 24-25, the R of those guys is negative 0.01. Again, like just zero correlation between their shooting and their usage. It doesn't change. I guess you might be wondering who were the 4 guys who were top 25 for 4 years, who saw their usage rise and their effective field goal percentage rise. I'll tell you who they are. Steph Curry, MVP. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, MVP. Damian Lillard, who at the time of me recording this doesn't even have a team, not an MVP, but an interesting addition to this group, and Joel Embiid, an MVP. That's it. Out of those 14 players who were top 25 for 4 years in a row, these are the guys that saw usage increase and effective field goal percentage increase. That's not to say the other guys are bad, of course, but they're the 4 guys who were able to somehow, as they do more, as a general correlation rule, be more efficient, which I think is relatively interesting. I hope it's relatively interesting. Anyway, I think it is. Let's dig into a little bit more of the data now, just to get, again, some more takeaways. I think you can understand what the general takeaway here is with this. If we look at the guys that, outside that top 25, where we started to see those big falls, like the big negatives, the bigger negatives, the guys ranked between 26 and 50. What happened in those guys? If we go back and use, who was 26 to 50 in 21-22 and 22-23. So you'll see all those numbers. So the guys ranked in 21-22 in that next grouping, the 26 to 50 ranking range, that had an R of negative 0.64. So that level of player, your third, fourth, fifth round fantasy guy, for example, that player, as they needed to do more, as their usage ramped up, they took an efficiency hit. Each of these years here, negative 6.64, negative 0.47, negative 0.39, negative 0.31. So that grouping of guys, that third, fourth, fifth, sixth round fantasy player, probably more fifth, third, fourth, fifth round fantasy player, no matter which year I'm using, whether they'll rank there in whatever year, you see that their efficiency drops. As a general rule, their efficiency drops as their usage rises. Again, I don't think that that's a surprise. Now we look at the next grouping, the 51 to 100s. Does the same sort of pattern hold? Well, yeah. Look at the numbers here. It's a relatively stable phenomenon. Negative 0.37 for 21-22 ranked guys. Negative 0.37 for the 22-23. Negative 0.48 for 23-24. Negative 0.48 for 24-25. So that grouping there of the 70 to 150 guys in just regular fantasy ranks, but in this sample, the 51 to 100 guys, that next 50 group of players, it's a pretty stable negative number. That the more your usage rises, the more your efficiency drops. That one's there, like it's about a negative 0.4 sort of overall each year. 37374848. So you know that number. It's a notable number. It's an important number. So when we're talking about this stuff from a fantasy point of view, if you're looking at a player and you see them moving to a different scenario, a different team, and the thing that's going to change for them is usage, okay? The thing that's going to change for that player is usage. Either they're on a new team or a different situation because others have left, and they're a player that doesn't really do huge amounts in other areas statistically, or you're not predicting them to do other things in other areas statistically, because there can be examples. Say, for example, I'll use this name here, Andrew Nembhard, right? With Tyrese Haliburton being out this season, we will expect some of his other stuff to rise. So his assist rate will rise, right? So that would take him from being someone who was like 160th or whatever. Maybe he becomes an idea of an 80th ranked player. Yeah? Because he's adding extra bits to his game, and the usage will also increase on top of that. So that's that sort of, I don't fully know how to explain that phenomenon part of it, but when we're talking about those guys, there are multiple factors with all this stuff that comes into play. And I think, again, we should be well aware of all that sort of thing. But if you see someone who is able to move and you think, well, this guy might actually push into a top 20 position this season because they're going to do more in other areas, then their usage and efficiency hit maybe isn't a thing. But if all you're expecting them to do is get more usage, but not necessarily rebound more, or steal more, or block more, or hit free throws more, or if you're not expecting any of that other stuff to change, it's just we're getting more shots. Jordan Poole, I wish I had this data. Jordan Poole, right? The efficiency in that sort of a player should be expected to drop. That's the expectation. So I want 6 names here I want to highlight because I talked about the 4 guys who were top 25 for 4 straight years who saw positive increases. I think we've determined that the overall trend is, unless you're a top-end guy, more usage means lower efficiency. These 6 names here are names to note because over the 4-year period that I looked at, they had a positive correlation on their usage versus effective field goal percentage. Trae Young, Karl Anthony Towns, DeMar DeRozan, Donovan Mitchell, Bam Adebayo, and Tyrese Haliburton. Players that as their usage rose, as a general rule, they were positively correlated to see their effective field goal percentage rise as well. So they were bucking that trend because they weren't guys that were top 25 every year. They were players that some of them had top 25 seasons, some of them haven't. Some of them have been there 3 years in the top 25, some of them have been 2, some of them have been 1. But the general rule with these guys is that as their usage went up, their effective field goal percentage also went up. So bucking the trend. The last thing that I want to talk about with this is, out of all those players we talked about, the 297, what sort of percentage of those players had strong correlations either way? Which again, we've given the numbers. We look at the breakdowns of players. But just showing who actually was where did we see the biggest impacts? Out of the 297 players, 63 of those players had an R of greater than 0.4, positive 0.4, meaning 63 out of 297, which we're talking about, as I try and work this out in my head, 20% of players, roughly 20% of players saw their effective field goal percentage rise as their usage rose. That's probably more than I thought it would be. 121 players had an R of less than negative 0.4, which is strong negative correlation. And we're talking about 45% or so of those players saw a sizable dip in efficiency when their usage rose. That also means that about 110 to 120 players, about another 40% or so, were in between negative 0.4 and positive 0.4, meaning that the correlation was relatively weak. The closer you get to 0, the more it doesn't matter. So, again, let's bring all this back and look at our overall hypothesis and try and work out a takeaway. The hypothesis was the higher your usage, the lower your efficiency. And the expectation was that the superstars are going to be the ones that buck those trends. I would say that we tested the hypothesis. The overall numbers suggest that yes, there is a weak to moderate negative correlation between usage percentage and effective field goal percentage. We also showed that top 25 players, it really doesn't impact them. That their efficiency could go up, it could go down. It's not correlated and related. Well, it's not correlated. It's like 0. It's like whatever. It's a random scatter plot for the top end players, which is what we thought. So coming back to that, what do we take away from this? What's our takeaway? Well, our takeaway is that we look at players and we need to see sort of what they do. But if we think that they're going to be able to be top 25 players, and then we're worried about what their usage is going to do to their efficiency, we shouldn't be as worried. If it's a player that we think role doesn't change in terms of the things they do, or we don't expect improvements in other areas, all we expect is for them to shoot more, well, we should be very worried about their efficiency. That's how I look at the takeaway of that. Now, when you get down to the bottom end of the rankings, it doesn't really matter that much because there's so many low usage guys chucked in there and guys that don't really matter. But when we look at the top 25 guys, the usage and efficiency doesn't really matter. The next grouping, which is the standard fantasy ranked players, it does. And it does have an impact. So I think, again, we look at the idea that superstars are insulated, or players that you think are going to be superstars can be insulated. Again, not a complete totality of a rule. But other guys, you expect it. And we like to play probabilities when we're doing things. Like the expectation is that you will lose usage you lose efficiency if you get more usage and you're not a top end guy. And if you are a top end guy and your usage goes up, well, you don't necessarily think that you're going to get a hit. You might get a hit, but you don't necessarily think you will. And I think that's the way that I want to look at this. I hope that was useful to you. I hope that data provides some concrete evidence to you of this phenomenon and shows you the extent of the phenomenon and how it's not just as simple as a blanket number, and how there is nuance between who the players are that get impacted and what value and how we can then forward project that. Hit thumbs up on the video if you liked it. If you stayed through and you enjoyed the math lesson, I hope that was okay for you as well. And I just think this sort of stuff is good evergreen content that we can come back to and look over. But I think there's some pretty strong results in that. Guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya.